together. I just want to point out a few things. So on the back, there are some handouts. One is pretty much an outline for the talk, so you don't have to take notes. Or you can jot down extra things. I know sometimes you're trying to fiercely write and listen and look all at the same time. So I gave you at least the key points. For those that might be watching the recording, feel free to email me and I can share that electronically. There's also an evaluation form that does have a front and a back. I'm required to ask these questions. You are not required to fill them out, however, but I do want to encourage you to fill that out. On the back side, on those questions, you can choose not to respond as well. So we can just pile these up at the end, totally anonymous, just provide some feedback, and I would appreciate that. So thanks again for having me. Again, my name is Julie, and I'm a horticulture outreach specialist. I do serve 3 counties. I do serve Jefferson County and Walworth and Rock. And how I serve those 3 counties is in this way, by presenting educational presentations about a variety of gardening topics. The other thing, other big part of my job is to answer gardening and landscaping questions. So if you have something happening in your yard, have a question about a tree, lawn, indoor plant, whatever, you can email me directly. We also have a website through the Extension Horticulture webpage, an online form you can fill out. And if you're in Jefferson, Walworth, or Rock, those questions get directed right to me and then I respond. If you happen to be in a neighboring county, those questions still get answered. They just get directed to somebody else that's serving that county. So if you have property up north or a friend in another county, those questions still get answered, okay? So before we jump in, just kind of want to talk about that we all have a really intrinsic nature to be by nature. But a lot of times in our environments and our workplaces, there's not a lot of nature, right? I mean, even looking around this room, we don't really have any live plants. We're not outside. We have really built up our environments to be kind of separate for nature, although we have this intrinsic part of us that wants to be by nature, that we actually feel better when we're around plants and when we're by nature. And there's been a lot of studies that plants and being with nature can help reduce stress, can improve productivity, improve your memory, improve your concentration, contribute to an overall improved sense of well-being. And that's, I mean, there's been a lot of research about that. So the effect of nature in the home and the workplace really serves to stimulate both our senses and the mind and improves mental cognition and performance. So I think sometimes there might be a misconception that you need to have a big yard to be a gardener. I refer to my indoor plant people as gardeners too. So whether you have indoor plants or outdoor plants, we can really still create those direct and indirect experiences and sensory experiences with environmental features. So adding plants to indoor and outdoor spaces. We can also have indirect experiences with nature through pictures or even artificial plants, natural materials in our spaces. And we can add plants, whenever we can add plants, there's a lot of ecological functions, especially when we add them to those outdoor spaces. So we're helping pollinators, we might be helping other wildlife, and things like that. So gardening can be done anywhere where you have access to soil, water, and light. So these are just kind of a smattering of examples of different things we're gonna kind of be touching on throughout the presentation. One thing kind of these pictures all have in common is that the plants are in some type of container, right? So we're gonna spend a lot of time talking about containers because that's pretty much, when you're talking about small space gardening, we're gonna need some type of container, but we can get creative with those, like the boot example, or you know, even that's the one on the top middle is like where you would put shoes, you know, and they've made an herb garden there. So you can get creative, be a little innovative, and we're going to talk about a lot of different things. So we're going to talk about how do you get started, things to consider for adding plants in your small spaces. We're going to talk a lot about what do plants need, because understanding the growing requirements of your plants can really set you up for success. And I want you to be set up for success. Sorry. And that's okay. We're going to talk about how to make every inch of space count. So there's some different methods and strategies that you can try to really maximize your garden space. And then lastly, you know, plant problems happen. We're going to talk about some management options for those. So getting started. really thinking about your space. There's kind of 3 different pictures here to represent some different spaces. So one might be a small yard on the left there. Maybe your soil isn't great in your yard, especially in an urban environment. Another kind of space might be a balcony. Another space is an indoor space. These are just examples, but kind of looking at these just examples of spaces and thinking about the space that you might have at home, divide it into 3. Divide it into a bottom, a middle, and a top. So your bottom layer is the floor or the ground or the bottom of that balcony. Do you have space to set things on that bottom layer, on the floor level, on the ground level? Your mid-level could be that balcony planter or a windowsill or a shelf. It could be kind of that mid-level. Do you have space there? And then finally, we're going to talk about kind of that vertical space, which could be something climbing up or even ceiling. So we have like the hanging plants. Do you have space maybe as that's your space because you don't have floor or mid-level space? Or maybe you have all 3 and you can use a combination. So really take a look at your space, be thinking about your space and divide it into those 3 and think realistically about maybe where some plants could grow there. There's also a couple other things hidden in this image. One is the clock and one is the piggy bank. So be really realistic about how much time and what your budget is. Because if you only have a few minutes, you know, realistically, a day, a week, a few plants in containers is going to be fine. If you have more time, maybe a raised bed or a spot at the community garden might work well. Because the more you want to plant, the more it's going to cost, right? And I'm really good at buying a lot of plants at the beginning of the year and then not keeping up with them and not watering them or just being overtaken by weeds, and then they fail. And that's essentially a big waste of money. So I want you to be successful, be really realistic, try to fight that temptation to plant too many things. Additionally, if we overcrowd our plants, they're going to be more susceptible to disease and other problems and end up failing. And they're going to compete with each other for nutrients and light. So that's going to be a problem, which we'll talk about. Another thing to consider is, what do you want to grow? Do you want to grow vegetables? You don't have to. You can grow flowers. You can grow a combination. They can be in the same container or the same area. Plant stuff that you want, that your family likes to eat. Don't feel like you have to plant things just because you're gardening or planting in a certain spot. You know, and you can get creative with that, but plant things that you want to eat or that your family wants to eat or that you want to use, or thinking about if you want to grow flowers to cut and have as a cut flower garden. I mean, think about kind of the purpose of that. A couple of other considerations, hopefully not for you, but just want to mention if there's maybe a theft, you know, consideration or a concern. Do you need some fencing? Even outdoor solar lights can help deter things like that. And another option, it would be to maximize with a neighbor, especially if you're living maybe in an apartment or a system where you have a neighbor that you can garden with. Maybe they can grow stuff, you can grow stuff, and you can share it. So a couple more considerations. So getting started with plant selection, really you want to choose plants and varieties that will grow well in the space that you have. I can't stress that important is to take the time to look at the plant label, take a look at those seed packets as you're picking them out. You know, I have this example of the skyscraper sunflower that can grow up to 12 feet, which is amazing. But if you're trying to grow it in a container on your balcony, that might not work if you didn't look at that seed packet. And I've done that. And my husband has bought me plants and never looked at the label. And then I go, well, this is for sun, and I have it in a shady, you know. So just take a look at those things. There's some clues too, especially if you're looking to plant things a little more compact or in a little smaller area. The plant label or the seed packet should have some of these clue words like patio or bush or even compact. Those are going to grow in a smaller form. And lots of different things. Plant breeding is an amazing science. Lots of different varieties come out in lots of different ways. They have zucchinis and squash out there that grow in very compact things. So you don't have to have a lot of space. If you want to grow tomatoes, the difference between determinate and indeterminate. So determinate is a tomato's growth habit where it grows to a certain point and then it sets all its fruit. It sets all its tomatoes at once, which is really great if you plan on using that for canning or if you want all those tomatoes at one spot, and they have a little more compact form. The indeterminate tomatoes are the ones that keep growing and keep setting fruit and keep growing and keep setting fruit. So like your cherry tomatoes are indeterminate. I have a picture during COVID. I was home a lot and my garden looked amazing and my cherry tomatoes were over my head. They were huge because they were indeterminate variety. So again, if you have the space for that where they can grow and you can support them, but they're going to need some supports as well. So just again, thinking of your space and choosing plants that are going to grow well in that space. Just real quick, if you want to grow, kind of choosing what to grow, seeds or transplants, it depends on what you're trying to grow. For some plants, seeds are going to need to be started here in March or April because they have a longer growing season. And some other things you can plant directly in the soil. So if you do want to plant like tomatoes and your peppers, your pumpkins, they need a longer growing season. But things like cucumbers do fine if you just direct sow them into your pot or into the soil or into wherever you're planting them. So you don't have to start everything indoors, but you might end up buying seedlings if it is something that has a longer growing season. So seed starting is great if you have the time and the space for it, but sometimes you can buy the young plants too. All right, we're gonna get into these basic requirements of plants because all these things are really important. Kind of as you approach any gardening, not just small space gardening, but any gardening, and we'll talk about each of these in turn. And just again, thinking about those spaces that you have, making sure that they have what the plants need to grow. So light, the quality, quantity, and duration of your light that your plants receive is going to affect their growth rate. Okay, the quality is that plants use different wavelengths. So as they're putting out their branches and their leaves, they're using more of that purple and blue on the visible spectrum. But as they flower and they fruit, they start to use more yellow and orange and red light. And if you're growing them outdoors, this happens naturally. This isn't something you're choosing. But if you're trying to grow plants indoors, those are going to be some requirements that you need for that indoor lighting. So I just bring it up in case you're thinking about indoor. If you're trying to grow a tomato plant indoors, it's going to require some significant lighting. And we'll talk about that a little bit later too. Quantity, how much sun does that spot get throughout the day? Is there some shade from a building or a tree that's interfering with that? Even overcast days can affect how much light they get. The duration, so a lot of times you see on the label something that says partial sun or partial shade. Well, what does that mean? So if you're trying to grow vegetables, you really need a lot of light. They need to be in full sun, 6+ hours a day. And that's why I say if you want to try to grow vegetables or any sort of produce indoors, you need a lot of light. You're going to have to invest in that supplemental lighting. There are some things that do a little bit better with about 4 to 6 hours of light. If you're looking at vegetables, that could be some of your greens. Your peas are okay, like your Swiss chard and your carrots should be okay with not quite all that light. Flowers, you can find flowers that grow in shade and sun. So again, look at those labels. And partial shade is kind of if it's getting, it could be a little bit of that morning sun, it could be afternoon sun, or kind of if you have a really shady area that's getting some dappled sun. So that partial shade is a little bit subjective there. So just keeping that in mind of when you're choosing plants or planting seeds and the spaces that you have. I will tell you, watering is probably the #1 reason why plants decline. People either overwater, underwater, or don't water properly. My video isn't going to work today, but I used to have a video here that showed the watering process. So if you give your plants a shower and you water and all the water hits the leaves, that is not a good watering practice. We want to water at the base of the plants, right at the soil level. You also want water to be able to drain through. So if they're planted in ground, you can't see the water coming out, but if it's planted in a container, you want to see the water coming out of the bottom of that container. So another thing to consider when you're thinking about your space, do you have access to water? Because if you're going to have to haul water, carry water, or wind up long hoses, are you going to be watering, especially when it's hot and dry and they need water once, twice a day, again, setting yourself up for success and being really realistic. If you are setting up things like rain barrels are great, but we can't use that water if it's coming off a roof. We can't use that for vegetables. So it's okay for flowers, things like that. But if you do have a rain barrel set up off of your roof, do not use that for any vegetable watering. Yeah.
Can you explain why not?
Because of the chemicals in the roofing material are going to be toxic to those plants, and then that's going to be toxic to you. Yeah. So, but if for flowers, you know, or watering your lawn if you need to, or things like that, it's okay, but not for your vegetables. We already talked about watering at the base, and then also water when your plants need it. So a lot of times we're like, well, I gotta water my plants every Monday or every Tuesday or every Saturday. Well, maybe, but also water when they need it. And your finger is the best water meter, the cheapest one you can get. You can buy water meters, but just putting your finger into the soil by that plant and seeing if it's dry or wet will determine. Because otherwise, if the plants, we're gonna talk about the soil, but if there's too much water, those plants are gonna end up rotting. Their roots are gonna rot. So we need to actually have that water drain through. Another thing to consider if you're thinking about balconies is where does that water go, because your neighbor might not want water coming over the balcony. Again, depending on your balcony, depending on where your plants are. So thinking some of those things about the space, your access to water, and where the water goes, and also how to water the plants. All right, soil. The best soil is tailored to your growing situation. So there's kind of this diagram here of what soil is. Soil is actually just made up of soil particles and air and water. And those spaces, those air spaces are really important too. So if you're gardening in ground, you might need to add things like compost to improve your soil. If your soil isn't great, that's when raised beds and containers are a great option, especially if your soil, a lot of times in our urban places and suburban, the soil is really compacted from construction. It's just not great. Where I live, the soil is like solid clay. It's really hard to work with. I've been adding compost, you know, over the years just to start improving it. But if you are gardening in containers, do not use that ground soil to fill your containers, because what happens in a container is all those good things about clay that actually help it retain water are really bad in a container. They just get magnified in a container. So we want to fill those containers with our own soil. So don't use the in-ground soil into your container. It's just too dense. Clay really consists of really microscopic particles, really small, and then it just gets really exaggerated in a container. And the other thing about containers and soil is you want to fill your container with soil. You don't need to be adding things to the bottom of that container. There used to be a thought, well, if I add gravel to the bottom of the container, it's going to drain better. And they've done research on this. It's been shown that just filling it up with soil. Now, if you have a really big container that you want to use, but the plants you're planting don't need to take up all that root space, then you can fill the bottom with some things like even recyclable materials, and then cover it with maybe some landscape fabric or something that still has drainage, but that's just to fill the space. You still have to have enough soil for whatever plants you're trying to grow, so they still want a full column of soil. But if you're even in your indoor plants or just a regular, you know, small container, just have full soil in there. You can purchase soil or you can DIY it. And I have these, it should be in your handout too. You know, the easiest is just to purchase it. You can purchase something that says potting soil or a potting mix. You can make your own. I don't know that it's going to save you money, but you can certainly combine soil and make your own. The easiest would be just getting some bag soil or a soilless potting soil and then combining that with some compost. A little bit of caution, you might see soilless mixes. They're a good choice, but they're really lightweight. And what happens too is that they can be a little hydrophobic, meaning they repel water. So before you plant, you want to water down that soil mix before you plant anything in it so that it's kind of soaked through. Otherwise, when you go to water it, then the soil just repels the water. And so if your mix is really light, then your containers, if you're doing it in containers, are going to have a threat of just tipping over too. So we want to, usually recommending putting, you know, mixing in some bagged compost or compost if you compost at home, some finished compost with that, either topsoil or a mix, a soil, like a potting mix. You can add some slow release fertilizer in there if there's not one included in the mix. A lot of times when you buy potting soil, there's already some included, so just check the label there. Yes?
What do you mean by soilless potting soil?
So it's essentially, there's no soil in it. It's called soilless. It's a soilless mix. So it's free of weeds, it's free of insects, it's free of disease. So it's a completely like clean dirt, but it's called soilless.
But it is soil.
Yeah, I mean it's not like your ground soil. It's called soilless. It's not quite the same, but
Okay.
yeah. And I don't know the process of how they make that, but if you're using that, I would mix it with something. Mix it with some compost. We kind of mentioned fertilizer. Plants need nutrients in order to grow. Just like us, we need our vitamins, we need our nutrients, we need to eat a balanced diet. But just because a little bit is good for plants does not mean we need to add a lot. So again, depending on what you're growing is going to determine how much fertilizer, how often to fertilize. If you're growing annuals and vegetables, they're heavy feeders. They need a lot of nutrients. They need a lot of water to grow. You're going to be probably fertilizing every couple weeks if you're just using like a liquid fertilizer or something that you dissolve, like a Miracle Grow. You just dissolve it in your water, and when you water, you're fertilizing as well. You're probably going to be adding every couple of weeks. The great thing is that fertilizers have labels, so read the label and it will tell you what to do. It will tell you the instructions on how often to fertilize and how to apply it. Now there are some things that are slow release, and you could probably just apply that during the growing season once, maybe twice, because those usually last about 3 months. So again, be careful with the labels. Organic products, you can use organic products. You may actually need to use them more often though, because the concentration of the nutrients in the organic products is smaller. So I'm not advocating for organic versus synthetic. Use what you want to use, just follow the label and fertilize appropriately. Because what happens to excess fertilizer is that it can run off and contaminate our waterways, lakes, streams, other water bodies and things like that.
I have a question. So when you use like the Miracle Grow,
Yeah.
you just put it on the soil. You don't put it on the plant.
Yeah, so yeah, you don't put it on the plant. So unless it's a foliar application, which means you're applying it to the leaves. But for your typical plants that you're growing in your garden or in your containers, you're applying it to the soil. Now there's things that you can dissolve in the water and then you water it in. But there are some other fertilizers that you apply to the leaves, but typically not in your vegetable or flower gardening.
What about Christmas cactus? Why was that doing too good?
Well, it could be a water light or soil issue, so yeah.
Why was this got Miracle Grow growing plant soil?
Yeah.
It was on top of it.
Does it have good drainage? We're going to talk about drainage. So I don't want to ruin the surprise. So yeah, things to consider. All of these things, if you're having problems with any of your plants, it's kind of like go through the checklist. How's the soil? Does it have drainage? Does that soil have air going through it? And how am I watering? Is it getting enough light? Every plant has different requirements. Just anything else about fertilizer? I think that's about it. Air, the leaves and the roots need air. So air circulation is really important. Air circulation is important to have in that soil so that the roots do have air to make those exchanges to uptake nutrients and water. But this is a picture of some tomatoes and it's just super crowded. And these, well, they look great now, but usually in Wisconsin by mid-season, all of our tomatoes start turning yellow. The leaves start turning yellow and getting spotted because there are foliar fungal diseases. That means there's fungus that affect the leaves. Air circulation this is a prime environment for those fungal diseases to grow. So a lot of times in the summer we have those really humid mornings, you know, right? Like you go out and you're like, wow, it's just really humid. And then sometimes that burns off. Humidity and lack of air circulation will make those fungal diseases thrive. They love those moist, humid environments. So we want to be careful that we don't crowd our plants. Sometimes we can do some pruning as well, especially with tomatoes, to make sure that there's airflow around the plants. Now that goes for any plant, not just in a small space, just anywhere we're planting. And protection from the elements, and also could be pests, yes.
With the air,
Yeah.
what if you think your container plant, the soil's too compacted,
Mhm.
maybe? That there's not enough air in the soil roots area? Is there a way, I mean, do you just repot it, or?
If you think it's that, I would repot it with some really, like a good potting soil mix. Cause even like the potting soils that you can buy are just fine. They have been, created as a good mix. Or if you're like, I wanna add something to that, you add some aged compost. You can buy compost, or if you have compost, just make sure it's been aged through. So maybe repotting it, it could be, especially, we didn't talk about this yet, but, reusing soil, it's expensive to keep buying soil every year, but you may wanna just freshen up the soil. If you talk to our plant pathologist, the disease specialist at UW, he's gonna tell you never to reuse soil because the diseases can live in that soil, right? But practical, maybe if the plant that you had growing there didn't have any diseases, you could reuse some of that soil. I would still refresh it. But the soil is gonna be drained of nutrients if you're reusing it every year too. Like, plants take up a lot of nutrients, and especially in a container, because they can't send out roots to go find other things. So I would try repotting it, especially a lot of times, like my house plants get a little neglected, and I go to water them and the water just doesn't even go through. Anybody else have that? I mean, you don't have to admit it here, it's okay. But that's a hydrophobic situation where I have to actually put it in a bucket, like a sink of water, and just let it soak for a couple of hours to kind of rehydrate that, because the water just bounces off. So my indoor plants have been a little hardy, but a little neglected. So it could be a situation like that, where if it hasn't been getting consistent watering, that soil, will harden up too. All right, anything else about that? I'm gonna talk more about drainage in containers too. We're gonna get into that. So protection, especially if you have some containers outside, we get some severe storms with that really bad wind and hail. I mean, we just had that storm with the hail coming down. So you may have to move those containers if you can. If you have stuff in the ground, obviously you can't move them, but maybe you have to give them a little protection. So just keeping an eye on those things. Protection may also mean from pests. So, the picture on the bottom left is of bunny damage. I get a lot of bunnies. Chipmunks like to eat, especially on vegetables. Yeah, those chipmunks, right? And the squirrels, I've seen them just eating the cherry tomatoes right off the plant. They come right up on the balcony or on the deck or up to your patio. They don't care. So just some things to consider. That you may need to, have some sort of barrier to keep them away. Sometimes there's not a whole lot of things you can do. Mulch, even in containers or in the ground, mulch is a really great way to help retain moisture and moderate the soil temperatures. And when I say prevent splashback onto leaves, that's when we're watering or when it rains, that when the water comes down and it splashes off the soil onto the leaves, that's when we're getting diseases spread from the soil onto the plant. So mulch helps prevent some of that splashback instead of just bare dirt. You can use any sort of material. I would encourage you to use some sort of organic, natural material, so that as that breaks down, that's helping the soil. Even in a container, you can still put, a little bit of straw around, or newspaper clippings, or some dried leaves. Grass clippings are great as long as they're not treated with any herbicide. Yeah.
Speaking of the mulch, like this winter, I tried to use my leaves, but obviously we didn't have a winter.
Yeah.
So now the leaves are just sitting there like they just fell off the tree.
Yeah.
How do you incorporate that? Would you just try to let them dry out, or what?
It's hard because it kind of depends on the type of trees you have, because some leaves, like maples, they get really matted, and then that's not going to be good either, because that's just like a matted mess. So, have you already mulched with the leaves?
Mm-mm.
No? Okay. Yeah, I mean, you could be using it to mulch if you're raking them up now and using them to mulch coming up here.
Can I use it like a base in a raised garden bed?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so we talked, those are all about kind of the plants themselves and their growing requirements. So really, those are the key things, thinking about those things, about especially the sun and the light, the water, the soil. All of those things are gonna set you up for success. We're gonna move into a little bit more of kind of some strategies and a little bit more about the structure. So kind of have some different things here. The top ones are more about the structure that we're kind of gardening in. This middle section is more about the technique, some strategies there, and then we have indoor options that I want to mention. So we're gonna go into each of these, but a little bit of an overview. You know, everything is gonna have advantages and disadvantages. For containers, we've already been talking a lot about containers. They're great. Almost anything can be grown in a container, but they can get heavy. Especially if you're trying to move them. They can tip over. They're gonna need frequent, consistent watering. So again, thinking about your access to water and being realistic, they are going to need more water. Containers and raised beds dry out more than in-ground gardening. Raised beds are great. You can build them to customize and fit any kind of need or space. Again, they're gonna dry out and they're gonna have some setup and maintenance, whether you're building them yourself or buying them. A vertical kind of space, that could be a plant that's growing, you know, up a fence or up a wall. That's definitely gonna save ground space, but you also need to account for the weight of that. A plant can get really heavy, especially if you're talking about like a tomato or a cucumber plant. They can get really heavy, so we wanna account for that. So containers, we're going to talk more about containers. They need to be big enough to support the plants when fully grown, hold the soil without spilling, have adequate drainage. I'm going to stress a lot about drainage, and never held products that would have been toxic, especially if you're growing vegetables. So really matching that container to the size of the plant, how big it's going to be when it's mature. So you need a bigger container, whatever that container is, for things like your tomatoes and your eggplants and your cucumbers and squash. And then a medium-sized container, you know, you can grow smaller things, and then in a really small container, you can grow your herbs and your greens and things like that. So again, looking at those plant labels, looking at those seed packets are gonna tell you how big they get. So pay attention to that, and just thinking through the size of the container. And larger pots are gonna hold moisture longer. And they're not as susceptible to tipping over the wind, but then they need more soil. So we're trying to balance all of these things in whatever space and budget that you have. And then flowers can be in any size depending on the flower, right? So some flowers don't get very big. You could grow those in a smaller container. Other flowers need, you know, more space. You can grow perennials in pots too. Again, it just depends on the plant itself. Okay, drainage is super important. So we want to check for those drainage holes, drill more if needed. And I love those decorative pots that are out there, but a lot of times they don't have sufficient drainage, or they don't have any drainage. This plant is actually a peace lily, and it looks like it's wilting. It looks like it needs water, but it actually has been soaked in water too much and not sufficient drainage, so it's having root rot issues, and that's why it's wilting. So wilting can be not enough water or too much water. It can be a symptom of kind of either direction. So we really want those holes in the bottom so the water can drain out. So when you're purchasing containers, check for drainage holes. If you're reusing containers or reusing recyclable materials, you know, you can use a yogurt container or an old bucket or something, drill those holes in there. If you're watering and there's like a saucer on the bottom, make sure to empty that saucer so it's not sitting in that water, because it could still be taking up water. If you have a pot sitting on your deck or on the patio or something, it helps to elevate that pot, because sometimes what happens, it actually kind of forms a little suction to that surface, and it gets kind of stuck there and actually ends up holding water. So raising things up off a little bit, you can buy the cute little, they're called pot feet. You can buy little things to raise them up. For my houseplants, I actually, when it's nice out, I take them all outside and water them outside and let them drain, and then bring them back in. During the winter, I just do it in my sink or in the shower to make sure all that water drains out. So we really want the water to drain through the bottom so it's flushing over the roots and flushing any built up salts or anything that can be in there, and giving them a good drink. The other thing with drainage too is that you want to give your plants a thorough watering versus just a little drink. Sometimes we're like, oh, just give it a little drink, give it a little drink, give it a little drink. We really want to water it completely so that water is coming out at the bottom, and that's a nice thorough watering. There's lots of types of containers out there, lots of different materials to choose from. It is just whatever you want to do. Of course, there's going to be a little bit of pros and cons to anything. Keep in mind that dark colors are going to be hotter and they could burn those young roots. Plastic are fine. You know, they're going to be lightweight, they're going to be less expensive, maybe not as durable. And I'm not saying go out and buy a ton of plastic, because that's not, you know, exactly environmentally friendly either. But if you have things that you can reuse them. You know, but plastic pots are an option. Terracotta, always a classic, great. They can really dry out quickly, and before you plant in them, water down that pot, like soak the pot in water, because what happens is if you don't and you plant, it actually acts as a wick and it pulls the water out of the soil. So before you plant in terracotta, just give the pot a watering before you plant in it. Ceramic is an option, of course, but again, do you have drainage holes? They can be really expensive or really heavy. They're not going to last outside in the winter, so you need to store them or protect them somehow. Fiberglass is another option you might see out there. Those are, of course, an option. Might be a little bit more expensive. You know, you see so many different things now out there, right? So wood could be an option. Just avoid any sort of treated wood, especially if you're growing vegetables. The self-watering ones are where you put water in the base, and then the idea is that the roots bring it up. That is fine, as long as the water is not like in touch with the plant itself. That you don't want it sitting in water. These fabric bags that they have now are fine. You know, they may not last from year to year. You may be able to get a couple of years out of them. They do dry out pretty quickly. But for storage, if you can make them last, you can just kind of wash them out and fold them up and store them away instead of having a bunch of pots. Yeah.
Just last year, I did an experiment with the fabric bag.
Yeah.
I caught the Walmart bags on sale, the cloth bags.
Oh, sure.
For like 25 cents. Potatoes did excellent.
They did great.
And carrots and everything.
Yeah.
So it was a cheaper version of that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and you can get creative. You don't have to buy, you know, a fancy new thing. Like, as long as it has drainage, and you can, if you have to drill holes, but or add drainage.
Do you have to keep the ceramic pots in storage during winter time?
Yeah, otherwise they might break.
Well, my uncle gave my grandmother two, and they've been outside since she's gone now.
Wow.
And they haven't got
Yeah.
yet.
Good.
But they're heavy.
Yeah, they're heavy, and maybe, and I think it's just gonna depend on, you know, how it's made, but you also see like just these kind of metal frames, and then you can fill that with this like coconut fiber, and you'll just probably have to replace that coconut fiber. Again, really good drainage there. You see that a lot on the hanging pots. As long as there's drainage and nothing blocking the drainage, you can grow pretty much anything. Yeah.
So you've got the metal with the coconut core, you called it?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
fiber?
Yeah.
Is that what you mentioned on page 2? It's for the mulch? Coconut, COIR?
Yep.
Okay.
That's an option. Yep. You can
Okay.
use that, and how that's sold is usually kind of like as a brick. And then as you break it up, or as you wet it down, it like expands and it opens up more. But it's usually sold as like a compressed package, like a
Okay.
brick.
Okay.
Yeah, but as you kind of open it up, if you're using it for mulch, otherwise they have these like mats you can buy. All right,
Oh, how can you get weeds naturally?
what's that?
Weeds.
Weeds we'll talk about.
Well, we have like a garden back in our house, and it's like a vegetable garden and flowers. Right now it's weeds,
Yeah.
shrub trees, weed trees I call them, and shrub roses that took over
Yeah.
half the garden. Is there any way we do the garden?
Yeah, we can talk about that at the end.
Or is it
Some
too far
ways.
gone?
Yeah, we can talk about some of that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so balcony gardens, again, I just wanna, kind of touch on a few points here. If this is the space that you have, again, thinking about, you have the floor of the balcony, the middle of the balcony, and the top, which might be the ceiling. Take note of kind of that sunlight, because if you have things blocking the sun and how that hits your balcony. South facing balconies are gonna get the most sun. Southeast or southwest are gonna do, but you may also consider some more shade plants if your balcony is not getting a lot of sun. A word of caution with balconies and like these kind of railing planters, wind is gonna be your biggest factor. And so you might need to secure these down so they don't fall or tip over, or if you know it's gonna be a stormy time, take them down, but really securing them. I was using some railing planters on my deck and they were really heavy, and my deck actually started to kind of bow a little, so my husband was not quite happy with those. So they, after even a small container, after you get soil in it and plants and you're watering it, they can get really heavy. So make sure that you have either the supports needed or what you need on that railing or that balcony. And then a balcony, which we mentioned too, just think about drainage, like where does that water go, especially if you're upstairs and it's coming down to showering your neighbor. If you need to have some, where you're watering in a tray or something, then being able to dump that water. So just kind of thinking through those things as you're planting. Raised beds are great. You can make a raised bed at any height, so it doesn't have to be, it's great to have it, so if you need to be standing versus bending over, you can get creative with these. You can buy pre-made ones, you can buy plans for ones, you can do it yourself, really customizable. Usually you can start plants a little bit earlier in the season because the soil in a raised bed warms up sooner than in the ground, so you usually get a little bit of a head start on it. Generally less weeding in a raised bed situation. They do dry out, so just remembering that watering, they're going to take some work to kind of maintain. And you can build even a temporary raised bed by just mounding soil up, but that soil will eventually kind of wash away from year to year. So you don't have to have it in a permanent structure either. You can get creative with that. And just don't use any treated wood, especially any copper, any chromated copper arsenate. That's going to be CCA treated wood, because that is going to be toxic to those plants, especially if you're doing vegetable gardening. So any kind of like pressure treated wood is just fine.
Here's a question.
Yeah.
In that picture on the lower left, the larger raised beds.
Yeah.
You had mentioned with smaller containers that you can't plant those year after year after year. You have to kind of fix the soil, add some new soil. How often do you have to do it with the larger raised beds?
Great question. I would probably be trying to refresh, not the whole thing of soil, because that would be a lot, but I would be adding at least some compost in there every year to help replenish the nutrients and the drainage in it. And just mixing in, and especially if you're using some organic mulch, that's going to help decompose and add to the soil too. But I would be adding at least compost every year, and then maybe refresh or adding new soil or freshening up the soil every couple, 2-3 years maybe.
You wouldn't fill that completely full of soil, would you?
No, especially if I'm just growing kind of my average plants. And if it's a big, raised bed, no, you could. That whole bottom probably isn't filled with soil. It's, it's just the base is down to the ground, but actually where the soil starts, there's probably a platform under there, or we could put something else on the bottom. But thinking about how big your plants need to get. So, it just depends on what plants you're trying to grow. But in a big raised bed, we're not filling that all the way to the ground with soil. With the planting in the raised bed, you can plant things. If it's a bigger raised bed, you can plant kind of in rows. Plant your tallest plants on the north side so they don't shade out your other plants. If you're planting vegetables, if you have multiple raised beds, try to rotate what's in each bed. So planting the plant families together, so like your tomatoes and eggplants and peppers in one, and your cucumbers and melons and squash in another, and then rotating them. depending on your space. If you only have one raised bed and they're all in the same bed, that's okay. Just rotate where they are in the bed. It's not a perfect system, but it will help with disease and things like that from year to year. So again, we kind of mentioned vertical space. You know, your vertical space could be plants that grow vertically and you're offering them the supports to grow up. Or it could be the space itself, as in the ceiling space or a hanging planter. So there's just some examples here. We had those hanging planters we saw before. We have kind of that palette structure of creating a vertical space and we're not putting plants that necessarily grow vertically in there, but we're creating this kind of vertical growing space. On the right hand side is more of those plants that are growing vertically, so you need to provide them some supports. Even if you just have a fence, use that fence, grow something by the fence. Again, look at your space and get creative with it. But again, thinking about that weight, wind, and spacing, a mature tomato plant can have, 30 pounds at harvest. A cucumber plant could be 20 pounds per plant if it's loaded with cucumbers. So things are gonna tip over, so we need to have really good supports. If you can use existing structures, great. You can construct your own. How do plants climb is another thing to think about. So like your cucumbers, they send out those little tendrils and they look for things to climb up. So that's why there's kind of the strings along that top right. On the bottom right is a tomato plant where you can have those clips that you're helping secure it to something so that it's not tipping over. So each plant has grows a little bit differently. You want to try to have your supports in place at the time of planting. So if you ever try to put a tomato cage over a tomato after it's already grown, I've broken, I end up breaking pieces off the plant. It doesn't work. So try to have those structures in place, and if you're adding things as they're growing, like these tomato clips and things like that, making sure you're checking on your plants. You can even use like old cloths or nylons to help like tie up the squash or tie up the cucumbers so they're not draping off the vine. So we're gonna switch to kind of some of these methods. Yeah.
Is there any concern in regards to metal fencing, or even if it's like black, fencing? Well, a fence.
Right. I haven't seen anything on that. I mean, we talk about not using containers, I think, because the soil and the water are in there, but I haven't seen anything about a fencing and it climbing up a fence.
I think I remember years ago I was trying to grow something and I put chicken wire up against my shed, and it must have got so hot it burned off all the little things that was climbing up on it. Because it was metal in the sun.
Yeah.
Too much sun.
Too much, yeah.
It burns it.
That's a possibility. I mean, if it's really in a sunny spot and you're having things be reflected on that area,
Okay.
it's a consideration. But if you have an existing fence and maybe it's not in such a blaring sun spot, you could use that. So with square foot, we're going to talk more about that. It's pretty easy to maintain, but it is going to be more difficult to grow those really bigger crops because they're going to overpower your space. Succession planting is you're planting things so that you have this continual harvest. I'm really bad at this because it takes a lot of planning, and by the midsummer I am just kind of over it. But midsummer you could be planting things for a fall harvest, so you can do it. It just requires a little bit of planning and reading those plant labels so that you can read the days to harvest. Same with interplanting and intercropping, just a little bit more planning. You could have a little bit of competition for water and nutrients, but we'll get into kind of what each of these are. So square foot is where you have that space, especially like a raised bed or an in-ground, this works really well, and you're dividing it into foot spaces, so square foot spaces. And the number of dots here represent how many plants you can plant in that square foot space. So it depends on what you're gonna plant. If you wanna plant some onions, you can put 16 of them in there. If you're gonna plant a tomato, you can only just plant one in that square foot. So this is a great picture because it shows lots of different things planted in a square foot space. You're just dividing it out, whether you use some, leftover wood boards or some string. Again, if you're trying to grow like a pumpkin plant, that could overtake everything else, but really good kind of space saver and trying to maximize space. your broccoli and your cabbage is gonna be that one plant per space, but if you're growing beets, you could put probably the 9 in a space, spinach, carrots you could plant in that smaller space. You could plant a lot more carrots or radishes in that square, you could plant more in there. So succession planting is where there's a couple different ways to do it. One is where you're continually, like every couple weeks, you're sowing the seeds so that you have this continual harvest. Lettuce is a great one to do this with, or your greens, your spinach and things like that. So every couple weeks you plant another batch of seeds so that you're harvesting throughout. The thing is, when we start getting into that hot, dry time, some things just aren't great for that. So if you can find varieties that maybe are more well suited to the heat, that's gonna a little bit more tolerant as you're trying to plant things. The other way to do this is to plant things, get started early, and as those things mature, then you're replacing them with things that are gonna mature later. So if you've started your cooler season crops, like getting your peas started early, and then those are done early, you're planting something else in that space. So you're just continually, instead of just planting one thing at a time in that space, you're trying to get multiple harvests out of it. Again, it takes some planning, so I'm not that great at it. Yes?
What are we guessing mid-season, summer season for planting is?
Yeah, so it's gonna depend on the plant and how many days to harvest. So, probably getting it planted late July, depending on what it is. I mean, you can have some quick things, like radishes are really quick, beans are pretty quick, peas are quick, but sometimes it's hard in the summer when it's really hot and dry to be planting some of those things. But it just depends. You got to read the label, because now there's so many different varieties of things that they're done at all different times. But like, you couldn't plant a tomato in end of July and have it ready in September. It needs a longer growing season. So it just kind of depends on what you're trying to grow. Let's see if I have any other more examples. So you could plant like I mentioned radishes, turnips, your Brussels sprouts are your cool season crops, but some things just can't tolerate the heat either. So your warm season crops are your beans and your cantaloupe, your corn, your peppers, squash, those need to be planted. Like, they can't be planted in April. They need to be planted in May or early June. Intercropping or interplanting, they're called the same thing. That's the same thing. There's different terms, but that's where you're kind of mixing things up a little bit. So you can plant your radishes and your carrots together, like in the same row, if you are planting in the ground or in a raised bed, because those radishes are going to be done really quick. And so when you're harvesting those, then the carrots are going to have room to grow. Another option is to plant things that maybe are okay with a little bit cooler soil, a little bit more shade, planting those in the shade of your taller plants. So again, a little bit of planning, a little bit of experimenting on how things grow, but making sure everything is still getting enough water. Again, these are just some techniques that are options to try to maximize your space. Your beets, your lettuce, spinach, and Swiss chard can be interplanted with broccoli or cauliflower, because those larger plants shade. The Three Sisters garden is an example of interplanting, where you have corn, beans, and squash. So the corn grows up vertically, the beans climb up the corn, so that's the support system for the beans, and the squash leaves kind of help shade out the soil and help keep weeds out, and they're growing along the bottom. So that's an interplanting mechanism right there that that we've had around for a long time. And then a couple indoors. I don't want to forget our indoors, because that's gardening too. You can grow houseplants and edibles inside. Again, using any indoor space that's available, but keep in mind those growing requirements of your plants. You might need supplemental lighting, especially if you're trying to grow vegetables inside. And it can get messy, right, with watering and dirt, or if you have cats or dogs that like to tip things over. And then hydroponics has been another great option, really kind of coming more popular lately, where you don't even need soil. It uses water and you just have control over everything. It does require lighting. You're going to need an artificial light, and you're going to either need to rent it. Some libraries now have hydroponic units. You can buy them. Even off Amazon, you can buy a little desktop unit, or you can build your own, and there's a lot of DIY things out there. So indoor plants, again, thinking about your space. If you don't have any great windows that have a lot of light, you either need to grow things that can grow in low light, or you need to add lights. It's just sometimes it's just not possible for everyone. My house, how it's situated, I do not have great windows for growing things. I have one window that's like the patio door where everybody comes in and out, so I can't load it up with plants. So I have to find things that grow in a little less light. And I'm not trying to grow herbs or vegetables inside unless I'm gonna buy lights. So just again, keeping that in mind. So if you wanna grow anything that's flowering or fruiting, you're gonna need a lot of supplemental light. And then hydroponics, again, that's just kind of what like a desktop or a tabletop unit sort of looks like. It doesn't use soil, so it uses, those are just grows in water, but then you're adding nutrients. There might be like a little soil kind of plug to help anchor the plants in. A lot of times you can buy this all with everything right with it, with the kit all together. So you might take a little research to kind of, learn how to do it, but you can grow a lot of things, and then the light is on top. So you can grow herbs and veggies and things using these hydroponic units. Just an option, maybe something to experiment with if you have no outdoor space and want to try growing indoor things, especially some fresh herbs and things too. So I want to talk about managing insects and diseases because they're probably going to happen. I know we all have had problems with them. Prevention, we talked a lot about what plants need, especially throughout the season. Proper planting, proper watering, air circulation, even just washing your containers from last year. Putting up some barriers, some fencing or some netting maybe to keep things off is going to be really helpful. So maybe you can prevent these problems. Be really nosy, look at your plants. All of a sudden this year I was seeing tomato hornworms on my tomato plants for the first time, and I never had them before, and now they were chewing all of my tomato plants. So you got to be really nosy, inspect your plants, look under the leaves for things. Those tomato hornworms, which are on the top right, they blend in, they look like the plant itself, so it's really hard to find things sometimes, but just checking your plants. And then if you do find something, we need to identify it. So try not to reach for that whatever spray right away. A lot of times people ask, oh, I saw a bug, what do I spray on it? Like, let's figure out what it is first and if we need to do something about it. Because you might not even need to do anything, or we might have something that's really easy that doesn't require chemicals. So there's lots of different things that are going to give you symptoms, holes in your leaves, the actual fruit chewed on, maybe some spots on the leaves. The top right is Japanese beetle damage, the powdery mildew on the bottom middle there, maybe wilting. On the bottom left is blossom end rot, which is not from a disease, that's just from a watering issue. Checking your plants and looking for these signs and symptoms of problems, and then we can figure out what's causing it, especially if you didn't see what made the holes. The top, let's see, the third one over on the top with the brown dots on the leaves, that looks like a disease, but that's actually from a four-lined plant bug. That's actually insect damage. So it looks like a fungal disease because it has those leaf spots, but it's actually from an insect. So, yeah.
The bottom rot, is that too much water or not enough?
The bottom what?
Rot, the bottom rot.
The bottom, this one here, Bottom left.
Yeah,
that's from blossom end rot is inconsistent watering.
inconsistent.
So it becomes a calcium uptake issue. So a lot of people like to put eggshells and Tums and calcium tabs in your soil. That's all really good myths. It's really just because maybe you were watering a lot and then you weren't watering, or vice versa. It's an uptake issue of the plant getting the calcium into the plant. So consistent watering is going to, and a lot of times you see this at the beginning of the season and then the plant kind of works itself out. The one next to it is from squash vine borer, so it looks like it's wilting, but it's actually an insect that has chewed that, and those are around here. I've had those too, and they actually chew, and so they're ruining those the tissues that bring the nutrients and the water up to the plant. So, wilting can be a lot of different things. So again, kind of looking at these symptoms and you can call me, you can send me pictures, and then we can figure out what's going on.
Question?
Yes?
What you were just talking about.
Oh, yeah.
which, if you go on the previous slide, on the bottom, not the blossom rot, but the next one,
Mm-hmm.
the squash plants, I've heard that putting like an icicle radish, like 3 or 4 icicle seeds in the mound of a squash plant, repels that
Oh.
worm or whatever that attacks the,
This down.
and I've had pretty good luck doing that.
Okay.
You just, an icicle radish and you leave it all season long.
And then, yeah, so you can do that too. There's also something called blue Hubbard squash, which is like essentially you're planting it as bait so that the insect goes to that bait and destroys that crop, and then your plants stay safe. So there are some things like that where you can use what we call trap plants or baits like that. So I haven't heard of the icicle radish. It'd be a good thing to try.
Companion planting.
Yeah.
Yes,
The companion planting, we
I
have,
researched companion
Yeah.
planting and organic planting years ago, and that's one of the things I read, and so I've used it ever since, and I think it works.
Yeah, and it could be working or it could just be coincidence, honestly. So if it's working, you know, or if that seems, the thing with squash vine borer, they wouldn't attack a radish though, because insects are host specific. So insects and diseases attack certain plants. That's why it's important to know what type of plant it is. So a squash vine borer isn't gonna eat a radish in a squash plant. It's gonna attack squash plants. But if you think it's working, maybe it's working. I mean,
some plants do give off,
Years.
that,
sure,
chemical balances and so forth too,
yeah.
so it can be something
I'll have to,
related.
I'm gonna look up that one because I haven't heard of that one in particular. So I've heard of blue Hubbard squash because they prefer, so insects have different preferences of what they like to eat. So sometimes they're gonna prefer, if this plant's available here, they'll go to this one instead of coming over to this one,
I don't
if it's
think
available.
the icicle radishes aren't, it's some kind of a repellent.
Yeah.
Somehow.
It might be, I'll look that one up. I have not heard of that, but that's a good, and that could be, it could be giving off something that's repelling that insect. So just again, get help with identifying, and you can call me, email me. I gave you my contact information. There's a website you can go to. It's just really important to identify it and then know what to do about it. Because a lot of times there's a lot of options, and we don't always have to turn to chemicals right away. There is something you might have heard of, integrated pest management. Really, that is just this really holistic approach where chemicals are kind of our last resort. And chemicals, if they're used, are used in combination with other things. But if we're growing really healthy plants, they're gonna be able to defend themselves a little bit. They're gonna be able to suffer some damage. And if we adjust our expectations that, not all bugs are bad, right? If there's some holes in our leaves, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we're part of a bigger ecosystem here too. So, but if you're seeing a lot of damage and things are just suffering, then let's figure out what it is. But many serious problems can just be, if you're regularly looking at your plants, picking things off manually, intervening early, we can avoid a lot of serious problems. And if we have these really healthy environments in our gardens and yards and neighborhoods, we're gonna have our beneficial insect predators too that will eat those things. So we wanna have those around. So yeah, chemicals, if you do have to resort to chemicals, just a reminder to read the label. The label is the law. It is a binding agreement that you use that chemical in accordance to what it is labeled for. So it needs to be labeled for what you're trying to treat it and the plant that you're using it on. But if you have any questions about using a chemical, please let me know. We can look up stuff. We can make sure that's gonna be used on what you're trying to use it on. And then just a quick note, you know what, artificial plants are great too. You can just go to they have them at the dollar store. You can just buy some fake plants. If it's just not working, you know what, they're coming out with some ones that really look realistic. So, and that still has all these benefits of improving our mood and improving our well-being. They really do. So if all else fails, just add some artificial plants to your space. But let me know if you have questions. I'm gonna address the weed question, because that was the one that came up, and then I'll stick around for more questions. So you have kind of a garden space that's just been overtaken by weeds, and you wanna use non-chemical methods.
Yeah, and shrub roses. My grandfather planted when we moved here,
Yeah,
too, and things happen, life happens.
Yeah.
Take care of my yard that month.
yeah, so one way, especially if you have like a space that maybe you're trying to kind of renovate and grow stuff in, or like I have a space that was lawn that I don't want lawn, and had some plants growing really close to the house, and I want to kind of fix that up. I'm gonna like kind of get rid of as much as I can, weed it as best as I can, and then put cardboard down, and then put soil and mulch on top of that. And that's called lasagna gardening or layered gardening. And you just leave that cardboard in, and you can plant directly into it, but the cardboard is gonna help smother everything if you don't wanna use chemicals. So you just leave that there, and then put soil and mulch on top.
Yeah, that sounds fun.
Yeah, especially if it's a smallish area. If you have a huge area, it's gonna be hard to do.
I think it's 12 by 15, I think.
Yeah,
Or 20.
yeah. So, even like a lot of like the grocery stores, they have all of that cardboard. If you can, or there's lots of sources, especially, but asking people or asking a store,
So
like,
if I have plastic, we wouldn't kill it.
what's that?
If I have plastic card, we wouldn't kill it.
You can also do plastic, but the thing with plastic is if you cover that area in plastic, that plastic is gonna have to be removed after a couple of years, but you're gonna have to leave it there,
Okay.
but then
Kill it.
removing it, yeah. With the cardboard, you can leave the cardboard and plant directly into it.
And rot.
Mm-hmm. It's gonna decompose.
It's called lasagna.
Lasagna gardening. I think I've also seen like mulch gardening or layered gardening, but yeah, go ahead.
Our smartphones have something on them that if you don't quite know what the bug is or whatever, you take a picture of it.
Yeah.
And then it will identify it. And it can be a plant or a tree or.
Yeah, it can sometimes identify it. I've had pretty good luck too. I have what I just use is Google Lens on mine. I take a picture and Google Lens it. Just a word of caution is that it might not identify it, or it might give you something that isn't in Wisconsin. So just like it's a good starting point of like, well, I think it's this, but then take that information and look it up. And when you do a search, especially if you're doing Google, if you just put the little .edu, a period edu after your search term, it's gonna bring you up university sources. That's how I do all of my Google searching, because I wanna use university research-based sources. Or if you put UW-Madison in, we have a lot of stuff, we just don't have it all, I'll admit. But if you put, or university, put some sort of keyword. I just use .edu, and that brings me up university sites. So if I look something up, then I'm doing like a second step of researching it. So yeah, our smartphones are great, but I just, word of caution that they're not always correct.
Our university has a lot of fact sheets.
Yes. And I share, if you email me or text me or message me a question, I will share resources too. So if something comes up this year, just shoot me a message, yeah.
A little off topic, but I heard on PBS, this was supposed to be a bad year for the cicadas. And it talked about them, destroying the young oak trees, maple trees, things like that. And, I've never heard of it. I mean, we've always had cicadas. I've never heard of them being damaged, but my son just put in 100 trees. And they're young trees, and they hopefully made it through last year with having to water because of the drought.
'Cause of the
and
drought.
I thought, is this something that he has to watch for with the
So what's happening with the cicadas is it's an emergence of the periodical cicadas. And it's actually 2 broods that are emerging, which has not happened since the early 1800s.
Oh, wow.
So they're emerging simultaneously this year, and I don't remember the brood numbers. I'd have to double check my resource, but I'm actually doing a program in May with our insect entomologist, a webinar, a free online Zoom webinar. We'll record it, I'm hosting it, and he's gonna talk about the cicadas. We're gonna start seeing those probably later in May. This Jefferson's area is not gonna be a hot spot. Lake Geneva, Janesville, they're gonna be hot spots. It's gonna be really noisy. It's gonna be kind of this phenomenon. So if you don't, cicadas are the ones that stay in the soil for years and years and years, and then they emerge out of the soil. They will be targeting the younger plants and shrubs of a certain, like a small diameter on the branches. I would keep an eye on it, and he may, I mean, it's gonna be hard with all those trees, but he may consider some netting or something just to keep them off. Not chemicals, not spraying, but something as a barrier. But
It's a trees under 4 years.
yeah,
Or
because-
target one.
right, because the cicadas themselves feed on a certain, insects prefer different things. They prefer certain types of plants, certain sizes of plants. So they may, especially on the younger plants, because they're smaller twig sizes, and what happens is the females lay their eggs in there too. So it shouldn't be like devastating, but I would keep an eye on it. Again, this area shouldn't be a hot spot. There will be some activity though, because these two broods are emerging at the same time.
Between that and the gypsy moths, it's tough.
Spongy moths are hard, yeah. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Good discussion. I'll stick around if anybody has any more questions.